Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are, and welcome to the IMRF Future SAR report webinar. My name is Jaakko Heikkilä. I'm the International Program Manager at the IMRF, and I'll be your host in today's webinar. So today we will be launching the IMRF Future SAR report. And I'm joined today by Brad Geiser from the National Sea Rescue Institute in South Africa, Tris Nui from the UK Coast Guard, and Jan Przedatek from Lloyd's Register Foundation. Please, you can use the chat to say hi to others or have a discussion. But if you have any questions to the talkers, please add them in the Q&A tab that you can find on your Teams. And today's agenda is I'll be first presenting the Future SAR report and the work that we have been doing in the project. Next slide, please. And after me, Brad and Tris will provide two organizational case studies from South Africa and from the UK. And finally, Jan will be talking about Lloyd's Register Foundation and the global maritime trends in 2050. And in the end, we will have a questions and answers session if you have anything to ask about the project. Okay, so let's move on and let me introduce the project, what we have done, and what is the outcome. So next slide, please. Okay, here we go. So many of us are used to see the world like this. But in reality, what it looks like is in the next slide, like this. 71% of the globe is ocean. But taking into account the third dimension, the depth or the height, 91% of the volume of living space is ocean. The ocean is extremely important for us in many ways. For hundreds of years, it has served as a major transport route for people and different kinds of goods. The ocean and the seas are also feeding us. 1 billion people depend on seafood as their primary source of animal protein. And the ocean provides us with countless different types of ecosystem services. But the ocean is also affected by the changing climate. Vast consensus on the state of knowledge regarding climate change aligns with the predictions of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And these point out that the climate is changing. It's changing rapidly, and human activities are the primary cause of this rapid change. Global average temperatures have risen over 1 degree of centigrade since pre-industrial times. We are currently aiming to limit this increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade. The ocean is also warming up. It's actually absorbing most of the heat that has been building up. If it hadn't absorbed all this heat, our climate would not have warmed by 1 degree since 1750, but by a staggering 36 degrees. Water has a huge heat capacity, so water temperature has so far risen only about 0.7 degrees. But even this relatively small increase has many impacts. We have seen an increase in extreme weather phenomena, heat waves, hurricanes, floods, droughts. They are more frequent and more intense. Extremes increase faster than the averages, and we at Search and Rescue, we often have to deal with the extremes. Climate change affects oceans in many ways. It affects the currents, wave power, sea level, and storm intensity. Sea level has been rising due to melting ice and warming water. As things get warmer, they expand. Sea level rise has accelerated from 0.6 millimeters per year up to 4.4 millimeters per year in the last century. This poses many threats to coastal communities. Sea level rise is also not uniformly distributed around the globe. Some places face much larger risks than others. We have also observed a 75% increase in tropical storm intensity in the North Atlantic and Western North Pacific. These stronger winds boost wave power. More powerful waves pose challenges to seafaring and navigation, as well as coastal ecosystems and infrastructure. Global wave power has increased by 31% over last 60 years. The largest waves have grown by 30 centimeters in just around 30 years. And again, the extremes are increasing faster than the average. Due to increased wind speeds and global warming, also the speed of global currents has increased by 15% per decade in most ocean areas. The ecosystems are altered. Marine life are migrating to new areas. We also experience phenomena such as coral bleaching and changes in freshwater stratification. Combined with habitat destruction and pollution, climate change is a major cause of biodiversity loss. In addition to changes in the atmosphere and the oceans, climate change is also increasing human health risks globally. These include, for instance, heat-related illnesses, spread of exotic diseases, and mental health impacts. This is because the socio-economic implications of climate change are and will be huge. We have impacts on, for instance, agriculture, fishing, tourism, transport, and infrastructures. Not to mention the huge challenge of population displacements. So there's an urgent need for a global response and collective action, as highlighted, for instance, by the Paris Agreement and recently the Dubai Agreement. So this is climate change in a nutshell as understood in 2024, emphasizing the need for urgent global mitigation and adaptation efforts to combat the effects on marine and terrestrial environments and human societies. And that's what brings us to the Future SAR project. Next slide, please. So, climate transition, as mentioned, will affect the economies and the communities profoundly. And as search and rescue services, we must also consider several things. We must think, how do we deal with the new types of rescue scenarios that will emerge? What kind of new technologies do we need to implement? How do we protect our own infrastructure? For instance, the lifeboat stations. And how do we adapt to all the shifts that happen in the society as well as in our own organizations? The IMRF Future SAR project is a structured first step to understand these issues. How do search and rescue services need to adapt, and what kind of further research and guidance will be needed? Next slide, please. So the IMRF Future SAR project is running or has been running from April 23 to April 24 with the funding from Lloyd's Register Foundation. The objectives of the project were to convene a working group to carry out a structured assessment of how maritime search and rescue services can adapt to the challenges of climate change. And it also set up as an objective to produce a report to form the basis for further research and guidance for the maritime SAR sector, with the ultimate aim of producing a library of freely available resources, just like is the case with the IMRF's existing mass rescue operations library. So what have we done in the project? The program was launched in April 23. And we have been doing a series of videos on the topic. These have been published through our social media outlets. We've also been involved in discussions. We had a devoted session at the World Maritime Rescue Congress in Rotterdam last summer, and we also held a workshop at the IMRF annual meeting in Norway. We've been interacting. There was a working group established in September last year. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Margaret. Thank you. Here is the working group. We are representatives from all continents except for Antarctica. From Africa, we have from Nigeria, Ibrahim Shetima Arfo from Nigerian Maritime Administration, and from South Africa, Brad Geister from National Sea Rescue Institute. From the Asia Pacific region, we have Wu Yu from Shandong International Ocean Engineering Training Center in China. And from New Zealand, we have Duncan Ferner from the New Zealand Search and Rescue Secretariat, and Alan Mundy from Surf Lifesaving New Zealand. From Europe, we have representatives from Finland. I'm based in Finland myself. From the Netherlands, we have Joost Beerens. From Sweden, we have Cecilia Jönsson from the SSRS. And from the United Kingdom, we have Anna Frizzell and Katie Young from the RNLI, and David Morris and Trish Newey from the UK Coast Guard. From North America, the representatives are Jeffrey Carroll from the Canadian Coast Guard and Colin Thompson from Canadian Coast Guard Auxiliary and Paramarine SAR. And from South America, we have Juan Silva Araya from Volunteer Corps of the Lifeboats of Valparaiso in Chile. Next slide, please. And what we've been doing, we've been meeting 6 times so far, and we've been identifying the potential impacts that climate change might have on search and rescue services, as well as some case examples and information resources. And we have come up with a public report and an executive summary. Next slide, please. So today you can find the report and the executive summary from the IMRF website. The executive summary is a shortened version of the report and highlights some of the main impacts which are identified in the report itself. Next slide, please. The report separately looks at adaptations required by search and rescue services to climate change and mitigation measures that these services could do to alleviate climatic change. But the emphasis of the report is on adaptation. And while the report focuses primarily on maritime search and rescue in oceans and seas, it also covers search and rescue operations conducted in inland lakes. The report is divided into impacts on different sectors of the search and rescue organization, including administration, vessel design and building, equipment, operational personnel and training, operations, which are further divided into volume, location, targets, and types, as well as search and rescue stations and units. The division is designed to assist the reader in looking into impacts which are relevant for them. The report comprises of 85 identified impacts climate change may have on search and rescue services. Each of the impacts is presented in the report and is further broken down into more detailed impact mechanisms. Next slide, please. The report also comprises 303 checklist items related to these identified impacts. The importance of each action varies depending on the specific circumstances, which are typical for each organization and location. Some of them are likely to influence all search and rescue organizations, whereas others will only be applicable to some. So organizations are encouraged to go through the impacts and the associated checklist items to assess which impacts are relevant for them either now or in the future. And as a concrete tool for search and rescue organizations, an Excel file listing all these checklist items can be also downloaded from our website for further use. Next slide, please. So what happens next? This is a living document. Despite identifying these 85 impacts and 303 checklist items, the report is not the final word. It's a living document that will evolve over time. We are planning to review it within 3 years from now. Note also that many of the issues and impacts highlighted in the report are potential. They are associated with different probabilities of occurring and different severities in terms of damage. They also affect different areas differently. It's also more than likely that we have ignored something. For instance, in one of the last meetings of the working group, a representative from Africa pointed out that we are missing sandstorms from the report. So we added that. But equally likely, we are probably missing something else as well. Therefore, we invite your feedback on the report. This QR code and the link can be found in the report and in the executive summary. Please provide us with feedback. We like to know if something is missing. We like to know the main impacts in your organization that you are facing currently or are expecting to face in the near future. If you have good case study descriptions of operations you have had to undertake because of climate change, or examples of adaptation or mitigation actions, please let us know. We also like to hear your views on what should be done in the future. Our current idea for the future is to continue the project by providing case examples, finding best practices, and providing preparation tools for adaptation and mitigation. And now that you are familiar with the project and its outcomes, let's have some flesh on the bones. And we have 2 case study examples from different organizations, and starting with South Africa. So I have the honor to present Brad Geyser, who is the Honorary Life Governor from National Sea Rescue Institute in South Africa. Brad has a vast knowledge of search and rescue. He joined the National Sea Rescue Institute in 1975 and has been a remarkable member of the NSRI family for the past 49 years. He currently serves on the Governance Board, Audit and Risk Committee. Brad's example inspires all and is a model of the best of the NSRI. He received the Marmion Mars Trophy in 2021. It's a trophy awarded annually to a person who has rendered distinguished service to the NSRI. So Brad, please, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. Margaret, are you going to put my picture up, or do I do that?
Brad, your presentation is displayed at the moment, so you can go on.
No, I know that, but I'm just checking if they wanted me to put on my camera, which I'll do that at the bottom.
Yes, please do that.
So good morning, everybody. It was an honor working on this group, and as always, when one works in a group like this, there is so much to learn, and we have learned so much, but I'm also very grateful to have been able to make a contribution. We're going to be talking about an NSRI perspective on tides of change. So Margaret, next slide. NSRI, who we are and what we do, is largely based on our original starting year of 1967, and we based our structure organization on the RNLI, but have evolved into something much different and much larger here in South Africa. It's a voluntary non-profit organization in South Africa, tasked with saving lives through drowning prevention and rescue services in South African waters. The idea being that preventing a drowning is far better and easier to achieve long-term than rescue services, but rescue services have been the main tool we've used up until now. We operate 49 bases comprising coastal stations, inland stations on dams and rivers, auxiliary stations, and lifeguard units. These are volunteer crews on standby at all hours, 24/7 around the year. There are over 1,000 volunteers equipped with sponsored rescue craft, rescue vehicles, quad bikes, tractors, and supported by an operations department at head office and our own emergency operations center, and is accredited by the Department of Transport as a recognized maritime search and rescue facility vital to South Africa's maritime well-being. We were founded in 1967, and we've grown from an inshore rescue service over the last 57 years into a highly capable search and rescue organization with multifaceted skills, part of the backbone of South Africa's search and rescue community. We're very conscious of climate change worldwide and in South Africa, and as a search and rescue organization. And with strategic planning in place to mitigate where our footprint can make a difference, we welcome participation in this IMRA initiative. Next slide, please, Margaret. So climate change in South Africa is largely represented by increased temperatures and rainfall variability. There are other aspects, but these are the two prominent ones. The effects are long periods of drought, extreme weather events becoming more prominent, heavy rainfall and violent coastal storms, depletion of water resources and biodiversity, resulting ultimately in soil erosion, which then decreases subsistence economies, placing stress on our government support and migration of people to cities. Cessation of cultural activities, heavy impact on formal agriculture and industry, and of course devastation of affected communities and livelihoods for years after the initial weather incidents, because it takes a very long time to recover from a mass climate change event or incident. South Africa is the world's 14th largest emitter of CO2, largely due to our current energy generation, reliant on coal and oil. But our government has pledged to reduce emissions from 2025 onwards, which was considered to be a peak in our normal generation methods. Next slide, please, Margaret. The extreme weather events in South Africa have created unexpected massive rainfall over short periods and extensive coastal surges right around the coast. The effects of these are flooding of rivers and low-lying coastal areas, significant disruption of services, water, electricity, communications, and rescue resources, cessation of any normal transport and related systems in those affected areas, devastation of housing and communities, trapped residents, multiple people and livestock in danger of drowning, complete destruction of infrastructure, toxic effluent released into rivers from damaged factories, search and rescue services overwhelmed by the sheer volume of active incidents at inland and coastal areas, result in exhaustion of search and rescue resources, especially when you've been working for many days without a break. Damage to search and rescue craft and equipment in punishing conditions in riverine rescues and high storm coastal areas. Injury to search and rescue crews operating in very different circumstances that they are normally accustomed to. And obviously inadequacy of current PPE to meet the so-called new normal. Slide change, please, Margaret. I'll give you two examples. Here's one. We had an extensive set of floods in KwaZulu-Natal, which is on the east coast just south of Mozambique in 2022. Search and rescue crews and local government rescue services worked for a week to complete rescues in this particular area alone. The incidents were a combination of flooding of roads and bridges alongside swollen rivers extensively, and then extensive flooding of housing communities in coastal areas and along riverbanks, workers trapped in factory buildings, families trapped in houses that collapsed on them, apartment buildings and houses collapsed along beach areas and riversides, all surrounded by fast-flowing swollen rivers. Initial rescue operations lasted some 48 hours of exhausting, non-stop work to find and rescue hundreds of residents. There was a significant death toll of those who were washed away and never found. Flooded rivers, hazardous to any marine craft attempting rescue operations, with anything from floating trees to full-size shipping containers to contend with coming down the river. Complicated rescues requiring skilled rope work to extract people from cars swept away and stuck in trees above the river. There were over 46 NSRI Bravery Awards awarded, which will be presented this June, July, of varying grades issued for this incident alone. Just to give you an idea, of the 5 NSRI stations that were involved in this particular rescue for those initial 48 hours and then the week after of cleanup. New slide. And then we started to see extended coastal weather patterns hitting from the west coast right around the tip of South Africa up the east coast. These search and rescue resources were again stretched by calls in September 2023. This was an extensive coastal flooding by wave action, mentioned by Jaco earlier, way above the high water mark, resulting from storm surge. There was damage to infrastructure in coastal communities. There were trapped people washed away before rescue services were able to reach them. Some NSRI stations on the coast and in one particular harbour were damaged and inaccessible to crew until the storm surges had subsided. Significant material damage, power and water supply damage, and then disconnected to prevent injury and fire. Local grid placed under severe strain as substations washed away. Loss of life due to lack of understanding by local populations of implications of a weather storm surge. And the results of these remain with us still as we try and rebuild some of the more devastated areas. Next slide, please, Margaret. So, lessons learned. Search and rescue resources must adapt to these tides of change. And that was one of the biggest learning curves we got out of not just these incidents, but out of working on this working group to find ways to sustain ourselves as a search and rescue organization when everybody else around us needed our help. So the main issues to be addressed was obviously in an administrative capacity, strategic planning, financial support, international collaboration, public education, and technology innovation. We are meeting conditions that the equipment we currently have was not designed to handle. Research, design, and building of rescue craft to handle the new normal, especially looking at, for instance, riverine operations, where all sorts of stuff under the water can take out power units in a very short space of time, making the vessels unmanageable. Equipment rethink to enable efficient surf rescues. How do you walk through a toxic parking lot in a factory to rescue people if your equipment can't handle it? Human resources training, management, wellness, and safety of crew are critical, especially when they are exposed to the extensive injury and damage that's created amongst the housing communities. Prepare for a much higher operational volume. These are non-stop operations where you have to either have people that can replace the initial responders, and you have to build for extended periods of time. This is not going to see finding a boat, towing it back, and all good. This is days and days of searching in horrifying conditions to find and rescue people that are trapped there. Review operation areas and readiness targets. Understand and plan for new operations types. Ensure our rescue bases can withstand exceptional events and still be able to operate. Ensure our rescue craft are new mission capable, and then increase our attention towards mitigation of climate change, because if we don't make a difference now, it's going to be too late later. But in the meantime, as Theodore Roosevelt said, do what you can with what you have where you are. And thank you once again for inviting me to participate in this. It's been a very educational experience. Now, if I can introduce Tristram Newey, who is the Police and Resilience Lead for the Directorate of His Majesty's Coast Guard in the UK. Over to you, Tristram.
Thank you very much, Brad. Yes, so Tris Newey, Civil Resilience Lead from HM Coast Guard. I'm very pleased to be presenting on this launch of the Future SAR project. It's been a pleasure to take part in this and to see the very good work that's been done internationally on this. And it's a very comprehensive document in terms of its scope and its content. I'm going to give just a very brief run through of the work that's been done in HM Coast Guard and, in fact, across Europe, European Coast Guard states or coastal states in thinking around the impacts on future weather as a result of climate change and some of the challenges and strategies that are being employed in terms of dealing with this challenge. So if you go to next slide, please. So just want to start really in looking at marine climate change impacts, and this is very much focused on the North Atlantic European region as being the area of interest for us. And really, it's notable of late that there's an increasing number of short duration, high impact incidents that are beginning to change the way that the Coast Guard are having to respond to incidents in the UK. We're doing more varying incident types, particularly relating to things that are impacted by flooding or extreme rainfall. Landslips and intense rainfall events are becoming more common, and increasingly so we're being asked to provide mutual aid support inland, as well as responding to events in the coast and the coastal margin. Indeed, this last winter was the first time that our meteorological office issued a red warning for rain, which hasn't happened before, and we were responding to that in quite a comprehensive manner in helping inland flooding incidents. So the increasing sea level rise and increasing instances of storminess and rainfall all combine to increase incident types that we don't normally have in the scale that we had. One of those is coastal erosion. We've seen that increasing more recently, with land being eroded away at an ever increasing rate at vulnerable parts of the coast, and cliff falls and the like happening more regularly now, increasing the danger to the people on the shoreline and who work and live on the coastal margin. And associated with that is the risk and the disruption to risk of disruption to communication routes. So increasingly, we rely on interconnected services to provide our communication capabilities, and if there wasn't work being done to improve the resilience of those already, then I think we would already be seeing some disruption to those communication links. And indeed, the risk of that happening increases with the increasing impact of severe weather, such as resulting in power cuts and so on, which can provide a significant challenge for the continued coordination and communication for incident response. So we're seeing new or rare incident types starting to arise. Wildfires, drought, landslips and incidents that are inland that increasingly require a larger response, that which our capabilities being drawn upon are starting to be seen more regularly, and we're having to prepare and change the way that we equip and train and prepare for these kind of incidents. Go to the next slide, please. So, of course, climate change is something that is very much in the forefront of government's view. There's a long-term view in terms of what our understanding of what that impact would be. So it's necessary for us to look to the future, but we know that the impacts of climate change are being felt now. The extremes of weather that we've had in the UK and across Europe in the last few years are very much understood to be more impactful because of the underlying increase in temperatures and sea levels and so on. So we know that there's going to be a continued increasing impact from that going forward. Sea level rise, for example, we know that there's going to be significant challenges around coastal low-lying regions impacted with high water events. And in fact, the weather patterns of late have shown to be, and demonstrably shown to be, more extreme because of that increase in global warming. The UK has seen its wettest 18-month period since 1836, and in the North Atlantic, as is reflected elsewhere across the world, but in the North Atlantic region, there are unprecedented sea surface temperatures at the moment. 2023 and going into 2024 is showing some increasingly extreme sea surface temperatures, and the impacts of those are yet to be perhaps realized, but we could expect there to be increasing numbers of storms, and perhaps as a result of increasing temperatures, increasingly intense rainfall events that will be particularly challenging as well going into the summer and beyond. So how do we understand this risk, and how do we use that to inform our decisions going forward? Next slide, please. So there are tools that are being developed across a number of agencies and increasingly using modelling to allow us to do predictions as to where impacts will be felt. So we're using those tools in the UK to inform decisions on estate management and location of teams. In the UK, we have around 300 locations around the coast, all for where equipment is stored for our volunteer response teams to work from. And the example here, you can see there's one of those teams is within an impact area of flooding, and these models allow us to do some forward thinking about whether we need to relocate in the future some of that estate to a more resilient location, not just to ensure that the equipment base itself is protected from the impacts of flooding, but also that they're accessible throughout periods of high rainfall and flooding when we might be actually needed to go and access that equipment and respond. So there's access routes to and from the equipment base and to and from areas of coast of high risk that we need to get access to have to be taken into account. So using these models, they inform that landscape of future operating landscape. Not just looking at impacts of flooding, but also other things as well. If you go to the next slide, please. Sea level predictions, of course, is something of interest. We're combining our understanding of the risk to flooding and wave overtopping, particularly in terms of that decision making around where we place equipment and how we equip our teams going forward to the future. But something we've already seen and will increasingly see is the impacts of droughts and wildfires, and the impacts on our teams itself of operating in these unusual environments. So, for example, ironically, despite having the wettest 18 months in the early part of last year, we were looking at the severe drought in some parts of the UK, and the unavailability of water would have a significant impact on the ability of our teams to maintain equipment and maintain operational readiness following a deployment, because they would be unable to simply clean equipment and be able to put it back in service. So we're having to think carefully around the logistics around that, being able to move water from one part of the UK to another for our own purposes, for example, in order to maintain operational readiness. And of course, we're responding as well to a greater range of mutual aid incidents than ever. So we're supporting our other emergency services inland more often than we ever have done before, particularly in response to flooding. Next slide, please. But it's not just about how we decide to equip and train our people. We're also seeing it's quite a significant change in the way that the sea is being used and the marine activities that go on in the sea. Hotter temperatures bring more people to the coastline, and in the UK, that can put significant pressure on services at over very short timescales as everybody heads to the sea. And the type of activities that are being done are changing quite significantly as a result of those increased temperatures. We see more incidents involving, for example, inflatable kayaks, which are very easily obtainable now, and other hobbies and other pursuits that people are taking at the sea, but interesting and novel ways of getting into trouble that we have to deal with and then plan for going forwards. So that's around the response side, but there's also concerns or considerations that need to be given around the greening of our operations, such as adaptation of electric vehicles and reduction in CO2, because that's a necessary part of ensuring that we are participating in part of the societal need to ensure that we are mitigating our impact in terms of the environment and going forward. So next slide, please. So how are we going to look at adapting to the future? Well, one of the main priorities immediately for us is to continue to improve our flood response capability. That's the one area in which we are increasingly being asked to respond, and looking forward to the future, we can foresee that with increased instances of coastal inundation, short, intense, heavy rain events that result in flooding in the coastal margin, and flash flooding and so on, there's that requirement for us to make sure that our flood response capability is as good as it needs to be, with new equipment and new training, and to complement that, we're using a technology that's coming increasingly more available now to us for ensuring that our situational awareness is up to date, so that operationally and in real time, we've got the ability to minimize the risk to our responders and optimize the use of our resources in rescue so that we can get to the right people in the right place at the right time, whilst also maintaining an ability to keep our operational effectiveness in play. So we're increasingly using fixed wing aircraft and unmanned aeronautical vehicles to provide real-time situational awareness in that very dynamic and changing environment. And also associated with that, we're investing in more resilient systems, looking to the future, having a redundancy and making sure that what we use in terms of our equipment, our communication capabilities are actually effective within the challenges that we can foresee going forward, increasingly operating in areas that may have no power, or in severe weather and very challenging operational conditions that would otherwise cause equipment to fail or to be suboptimal. So investment in equipment, investment in our people, in our training, and a continual review of equipment and making sure that it remains fit for purpose as we go into this new future. Next slide, please. Thank you. So a number of strategies are being developed. It's still very much early in that process, but we are looking to ensure that we are, as I said before, minimizing our impact on the environment. So we're reducing our CO2 emissions as an organization through a greening project, making sure that we are participating in that requirement as an organization to mitigate our impact on the environment going forwards. But one of the biggest challenges, and it exists for everybody in every part of the response field and partner agencies as well, is that investing in the future of impacts for climate needs a long view, and some of the investments will need to be done over a bigger timescale than current budgets are set to. So that's a significant challenge, I think, for everybody, where we're looking 10, 20, 30 years in the future. But our budget cycles are maybe set on 5 or 2 to 5 years or something like that. So that's going to be a particular challenge that still needs to be looked at, I think, and will continue to be a challenge in the future. But one of the key things that we've done, and I think very important, if possible, is to engage with national risk assessments to understand the impacts that are likely to happen to a country and have a say in how those impacts might be realised and what mitigations and adaptations and response requirements might be needed for them, and therefore having a voice in adaptation programmes. So we're very much engaged with that at the government level and putting input into those programmes. Next slide, please. And that's it from me. Thank you very much for the opportunity for presenting on this. I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Jan, Director of Technologies at Lloyd's Register Foundation. Over to you, Dr. Jan.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tristan. My name's Jan Sudatek. Next slide, please. My name's Jan Sudatek. I'm Director of Technologies here at the Lloyd's Register Foundation. And next slide, please. So we're a UK registered charity, but we have a global vision to engineer a safer world. And we do that by finding, identifying, collecting and creating the best evidence that we can to understand where the real challenges lie. And then with the knowledge of what the real challenges are, we go out and we work with and through the best people we can find in order to make changes in the world, lasting changes that make the world come up with safer outcomes to the things that happen. And through our ownership of Lloyd's Register Group, we have a heritage that goes back to 1760. So the maritime world of the ocean, the blue economy, is very much in our blood, our DNA, going back 260 years. But on top of that, we've also been collecting the history of maritime since 1760. So we have 3 industrial revolutions within our history. We have a whole series of changes, both technical and social and trade, economic, And we use that in new and exciting ways. So our heritage collection is growing. It's connecting different heritage sets together. And it's important because we're using that not only with evidence and insight of the problems today and tomorrow, but we're looking at hindsight. What can we learn from the past in order to look at contemporary problems that we're facing? And as a foundation, there are 3 areas that we are increasingly focusing on as challenge areas. The first one of those is around the disruption caused from technological change. So technology can come and it can help to make things safer, but also there's technology coming and we need to make sure that that technology is going to be deployed in a safe way. And we've heard some examples of technology today that are coming, and we need to make sure that they help us, but also in their adoption don't harm us. We're also looking at the transition to a decarbonised world. So there are many changes coming in that, and safety is something that has to be part of that transition, both making sure that things are designed and operated safely, but we also have people that are trained to be able to operate those safely. And the final part of the 3 challenges we're focusing on is looking at adaptation to climate change. And I think what you'll see is from the 3 focus areas we have, you maybe understand why the Safer SAR is something that we have supported, because for us it's very close to the things that we're looking at, and it paints part of the picture of things that we need to understand going forward. Next slide, please. But what I'd like to really talk about today is a program that we have running, which is called the Global Maritime Trends 2050. Now, it's a collaboration initially between Lloyd's Register Foundation, Lloyd's Register Group, and we work together with The Economist Impact to start looking at what the future of the marine and maritime world will look like by the time we get to 2050 and the journey to get there. It's based upon gathering evidence and data that's available or being produced, from forecasts, from literature reviews, and from a series of interviews to understand what the world is going to look like. And this was published in October last year, and it's available for download. The link is there, and I know that Margaret's going to put the link into the chat as well. But next slide, please, Margaret. So when we were setting out to carry out the Global Maritime Trends 2050 report, there were some things that were of real importance in what we were looking at. And the first of those is we had to consider that everything was an interconnected system. So whatever happens in one area will probably have an impact somewhere else. So these are not separate impacts. And then from there, we started to look at what these trends are that will end up interacting. And there were a set of 5 of them. So one of those was around environmental changes. And I think the Future SAR report, what we've been hearing about the changes in environment and climate, is a strong part of that. And the report talks about those changes. It talks about technological changes. So there is technology coming with digital technologies or decarbonisation technologies or major positive engineering type technologies that are coming, and what impact will they play in the world ahead of us. Talk about natural resources, whether this is about natural resources that are mined or whether it's natural resources that are harnessed, such as renewable energy. How will that change the focus of what happens globally? It looks at geopolitical and macroeconomic changes. So how is trade going to look? Where is the wealth going to be flowing across the globe? Are we going to be working together or increasingly working apart? It comes out of there. And finally, the last trend really is talking about social change. So an example of that would be, where will people be living? So we know that there's demographic change happening in the world over the next 50 years. Some countries will have more people, some countries will have less people. There'll be migration, there'll be changes in what people expect for jobs, for example, and how long you have to train for jobs. There's a number of areas in there which we've been looking at. Next slide, please. And within the report, we start to identify 4 possible transition futures that we see ahead of us. And they're based upon effectively how much we're going to cooperate or fragment in the way we work, and whether the transition that's going to happen is going to be gradual and slow, or whether it's going to accelerate and grow really quickly. So these are really significant transitions, and we need to understand which one we're heading towards. And if we understand what these different transitions look like, it also means that we can start to plan to avoid the ones that perhaps are less good for us, try to work on the ones that are more beneficial for us. But even if things don't go the way we would like, there are things that policymakers, industry, organizations, including yourselves in the search and rescue world, ourselves in the NGO world, can start to do to try and prepare for these. And within these transitions, in order to bring them to life, the report itself starts to talk about, gives examples of what those sorts of transitions could look like. So it creates some scenarios that we could try to to understand what they mean. So what the first scenario talks about a just and gradual transition change. Now, in this, we're talking about the world coming together, having standards that work together, and they're moving to a green hydrogen economy by 2050. What would that look like, and what is needed to get to that sort of a scenario? The rapid tech-driven transition starts to assume that we're living in a world where we have cooperation and rapid technological change. So what would the world look like if we had more automated technology solutions that were being widely adopted by 2050? How would that change the ocean economy, the blue economy, and everything that relies on it? If we look at the scenario that we have in a delayed transition, this talks about an example where we have rapid population growth in certain areas, but we have regionalization and deglobalization and fragmentation of global maritime trade. So what does that look like? What changes does that bring around? And how do we know if we're on that trajectory? And finally, if we think about the regionalized and fragmented transition, this looks at a scenario of the future where the average global sea level rise is increasing by 40 centimeters by 2050. And what impact is that having on our coastlines, on cities, on ports, on all sorts of areas that will be affected? What does that actually mean? How will that impact the infrastructures in and around the sea? But also, you could also say, how would that impact the operations that you have? So next slide, please. But for us, we're moving into an exciting 5 years ahead, and just wanted to share a few things that we're going to be doing. So we haven't finished with the Maritime Trends 2050. What we're going to be doing in the years to come is a series of deep dives that start to explore in greater depth what some of the scenarios and implications are of what the report is saying. And as part of that, we ask for your help. So we're trying to understand what are the real needs, what do people really need to understand going forwards. So if you have ideas for trends that we could start to dive into a bit more, then we would absolutely welcome your ideas on our website for that. We're moving into a way of working called Maritime Connected. And when you look at the marine and maritime worlds, what you'll often find is that you have siloed thinking, you have groups that talk to each other, but they don't talk outside their part of the ecosystem or their groupings. You get people from the global north that maybe don't talk to those from the global south, so not all voices are heard. So we're looking to set up something called Maritime Connected that starts to break down more of those barriers and start to make sure that more of the stakeholders from across the globe have a say, are able to collectively understand each other, understand the challenges ahead, and then also find a way to work forwards towards solutions that work for all. In terms of decarbonisation, we already have our Maritime Decarbonisation Hub, that's an evidence-based hub looking at the changes that are coming and how we can prepare for them. We also support the Just Transition Task Force, the UN Global Compact, the IMO, which is looking about how we transition to jobs. We have some activities that are working in the Eastern Mediterranean with Helmepa to understand how ports and seafarer work life activities are going to change and what training that's needed there, what adaptations are needed there, and their work in this space is going to grow. We have work with looking at autonomy. How can we adopt it safely? So how can we assure it so that it can be adopted safely? And what are the barriers to the adoption of AI? How can you make a business case for whatever business you're in for the use of AI to help you? We're going to be looking at climate adaptation, so we have work on major positive engineering that's currently underway, but we're also trying to be more locally led. It's very easy being in London and trying to understand the problems, but the real challenges are best understood in different parts of the world. So we're starting to establish safety leadership hubs, with the first of those being in Brazil, Ghana, Kenya, India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and the Philippines, where there are big ambitions at national level for growing those ocean economies. So how can we work with industry and government to identify how those industries can grow safely, to have safe outcomes, and then what can we do to help make that happen? And finally, as I mentioned right at the beginning, we have our heritage archive. So we're trying to learn from the things that have happened in the past in order to be able to understand how we might approach some of the contemporary problems that we're facing now and in the future. So with that, thank you. And I'm going to hand back to Jakob.
Thank you, Jan. Well, as you said in the title, what an exciting 5 years you're looking into. Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you also, Brad, and thank you, Trism. Very inspiring and thoughtful presentations. Since the chat doesn't seem to be working, Tom has added the link to the report to the Q&A section of Teams, so you can find the report or the link to the IMRF website there, and on that page you can find the report and the executive summary and the Excel file. Also, Margaret and Tom, if you can add Jan's link to the Maritime Trends report in the Q&A as well, so that would be nice. We have around 1 minute for questions. I guess we can overrun a couple of minutes if there are a lot of questions, but if you have anything to ask our speakers, now is a good time to put them in the Q&A. There is a question from Tim Rousel. Most of what SAR organizations will still be doing would be considered normal operations. What work has been done to identify the change in day-to-day maritime risk, for example, increasing leisure activity and renewables, decreasing fishing, autonomous shipping, and so on? At the RNLI, this is a key element we are looking at, so would be great to have wider conversations. Tris, do you have, for instance, something to comment on that?
Yeah, certainly. So in terms of understanding the changing maritime risk, the day-to-day changes or the year-to-year changes in the way that leisure activities are being run, the change in the energy sector as well, with renewable energy wind farms being built, which is a particularly big project around the UK and other parts of the world. There are lots of tools available now to organisations to enable to track trends based on data that they collect. So I think that the future is very much data driven in order to inform those decisions that need to be made. And we've increasingly been using tools in the Coast Guard to look at past data, identify trends that are occurring in the way of, for example, the numbers of people that we're rescuing year on year and the types of activity that they're undergoing, and linking that to. We started to look at linking that to things like the weather forecasting and the weather at the scene, and looking for those linkages between not just sheer numbers of who was attending, but why they went where they did, what factors were in play around those incident types, and how that links to climate change is of course it also shows changing trends and so on in terms of how that operational space works. And if you look at the offshore energy area, where there's an increasing number of wind farms being built offshore, that itself is a challenge to understand how the response of a SAR organisation to incidents in and around those wind farms areas would be run, because you have particular issues around getting, for example, aircraft in to do rescue, the challenges of doing search in an area that has a large number of objects within it, and just the navigational hazards that it implies as well. So it's a bit of a mix. It's a mix of, I think, understanding what we know from the data that the organisation has itself, but also being engaged in the right places to have an understanding of the forward look of the industry and the government intent in terms of for example, the mix of energy from renewables and so on, just to get an understanding of what the future looks like in terms of that picture, and then we can plan ahead in order to ensure that we put the right investment in the right place to ensure that we're keeping pace and are ready for the challenges that are coming in the next 10, 20 years, certainly. So I hope that answers that question to some extent.
Thank you, Tris. I added the link to the Lloyd's report also in the Q&A, so you can find the report link there. Any other urgent or not so urgent questions, but any other questions? I think we can take one more question if there are any. If no, then I really want to thank all the participants. I want to thank the presenters in this seminar and webinar. I want to thank Margaret and Tom for doing the technical things. I'd like to thank the working group that has been doing this report, and please log into IMRF website, check out the report, check out the executive summary, and give us some feedback on that report. And while you're doing that, check out also the Global Maritime Trends report. It's a really good report, which we also used in our work. But with those words, I'll check if I was going to say something else. No, I think that's it. So I thank you, and have a nice rest of the spring, and have a nice rest of the week as well. And I'll hope to see you later in IMRF future events.
Yeah, Easter weekend for us here in South Africa. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for listening, and thanks for the invite to participate. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Jaco. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.